extra chapter on the theory of rent, i.e., by way of illustrate to summarize, 1. The new topics of the 1861-3 manuscripts are not really new. Competition and rent had always been in Marx's plans. They are new in the sense that Marx dealt with them more systematically in the 1861-3 manuscripts. 2. If compared with the previous plans, however, their position did not change after this deeper analysis. It was accumulation, of a single capital and many capitals, that changed its position. 3. After this change, the concept of capital in general, the process of positing capital's own presuppositions, was not dropped. On the contrary, that concept became more consistent. 4. Marx's final decision was to reduce the entire exposition to capital in general only, differently named, and to insert the novelties as just illustrations, because he probably understood he did not have the time and energy to get through such a big and complicated subject. In January 1863, Marx began to write Section 1I, or better continued what he had written in 1861. After the exposition of the accumulation of a single capital, he started to analyze total social reproduction, or the accumulation of capitals, which is what he called in this period circulation and reproduction, a theme that was familiar to him also through Quesnay's Tableau économique. If Marx had understood that both accumulations should be placed before profit, it was not yet clear what the precise position of the second, total social reproduction, should be, also because he had not yet precisely outlined the structure of Section 2. It was then better to start over in a more systematic way with the third huge manuscript, 1863-5. 1863-5 In the 1863-5 manuscript, for the first time Marx wrote capital according to the final three-volume plan. 43 He started with Volume 1 and then passed to the third, skipping again Volume 2. After writing Section 1 of Volume 3, he went back and wrote for the first time Volume 2, and then he finished Volume 3. We have only a few pages that have survived from Volume 1. The main part is the famous sixth chapter on results of the immediate process of production. It is, however, certain that this text later became the basis for later manuscripts. It would be started over in 1865 and further modified before the publication of the first German edition in 1867. In that first draft, Marx probably did not mean to write a new account of the commodity and money and commodity circulation, but to continue on the basis of a contribution. At a certain point he also decided not to include Chapter 6 and also to write the history of the theory in a separate book. These modifications do not alter the structure described above, so I will not deal with this here and will instead move to Volume 2. The first point to stress is that capital circulation has always been placed within the framework of universality. What has changed is not this, but the necessity to include the analysis of total social reproduction, the second step of accumulation theory, within this framework. Marx drew this conclusion in the 1861-3 manuscript. We have seen how, at the end of that manuscript, he tried to develop a first formulation of total social reproduction, right after the accumulation of a single capital. At that moment, Marx did not have a new plan for Section 2, what will later be Volume 2. When in the first half of 1865 he wrote for the first time Volume 2, he listed 3 chapters, 1. Circulation process, 2. Turnover, and 3. Without a precise title. Only when he actually wrote that 43 I am talking about the 3 traditional volumes. At this point a separate fourth one on the history of the theory was not foreseen. Marx talked explicitly about these 3 books only later in a letter to Kugelmann. Here, next to those 3 books there was a fourth on the history of the theory. These 4 books were to be published in 3 volumes, Marx and Engels 1974, pages 533-4, Marx 1987 c. 1866, p. 328. I shall come back to this later. Chapter Did he provide a title, Circulation and Reproduction, 44 the same as the terms used in the 1861-3 manuscript to designate total social reproduction. This is the final outline of Volume 2. Marx will never finish this text. Although we have 8 manuscripts and a few drafts, the book remained a rough draft. In spite of this rough status, what was never changed was the structure of the 3 chapters, which can be considered definitive. Thanks to this complex system of presuppositions, it was finally possible adequately to posit capital and reach the capital/profit relationship, the final step of universality, or capital in general. The biggest issue concerns Volume 3 and capital in general. Marx's solution at the end of 1862 was to keep that concept and insert the additional new topics only as illustrations. This did not include credit and fictitious capital and probably not the second part of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. If we now compare the outline of Volume 3 in the 1863-5 manuscript and the plan of 1862, J, it is evident that they are different. 45 Here is a list of the main variations. 1. A chapter on competition, paragraph 3, chapter 10 in Engels's edition. Marx states here that the transformation is the result of the double process of competition. In J we have only the title of what would be paragraph 2, chapter 9 in Engels's edition. 2. The tendency of the rate of profit to fall is more elaborated than in the 1861-3 manuscript. The second part especially is more developed, where Marx sketches a theory of economic cycles. 46.3, there is, for the first time, a final complex chapter dedicated to credit and fictitious capital. For the readers of the traditional edition provided by Engels in 1894, it is not possible to see that credit and fictitious capital, the developed form of share capital, is the final part of the book on capital, and also that interest is the necessary dialectical passage to that part as a whole. 47 The first 4 chapters of Engels's edition, Part V, chapters XXI, XXIV, correspond to the manuscript, chapters 1 to 4. In the manuscript there is, however, a final chapter 5 with one single title, Credit and Fictitious Capital, again, the same final step since 1857 to 8. Engels transformed the general title into the title of just one chapter, XXV, next to many other chapters, most of which were nothing but Engels's editorial creations. He put together quotations Marx had collected in his manuscript, forming chapters that did not exist in Marx's manuscript. Marx's point 5 was like this. 3. Continuation from page 561. Confusion. Continuation from page 583.484, after credit and fictitious capital, there is a section for rent, a sort of book within the book. It is no longer an illustration as it was in J5, there is a final section on revenues and their sources. This was already in J. In the 1861-3 manuscript we also have a first exposition of this section, but their rent was excluded. Now it is included. These topics, which evidently go beyond the limits of universality, are no longer just illustrations, some of them were not even mentioned before at all, but are now structural parts of the theory. Why were they put in? Are they necessary for a consistent theory of capital? What is the status of capital in general now? Before we deal with these questions, we need to look at how Marx was planning to structure the concept of capital now that the main focus had changed. The new 3-volume plan was like this. Volume 1 was supposed to contain both Book 1, Production Process, and 2, Circulation Process. Volume 2 was supposed to contain Book 3, Gesamtgestaltungen. Volume 3 was supposed to contain Book 4, History of the Theory, never written. Point 49 Even if the old general logic was not changed, now the focus is no longer on the 3 levels of abstraction, U, P, S, capital in general, competition, credit and fictitious capital, but on essence and manifestation. Point 50 Volume 1 should include what comes before profit, Book 1 on production plus Book 2 on circulation, that is, essence, whereas Volume 2 should treat the forms of manifestation, Book 3, After Profit. The title of Section 3 of 1862, J, is Capital and Profit, the same as Section 1 of Volume 3. The question is, in order to analyze even at the highest level of abstraction the forms of manifestation of capital, is it possible not to include competition, credit, and fictitious capital, and rent as organic parts of the theory? The answer is no. This is why Marx, while writing the manuscript, changed his mind once more and went back to the old plan, U, P, S, but within the new framework essence/manifestation. Not those entire books, but their abstract essential lines needed to be included. This was the only way he could be able to speak scientifically, at the end, of the three classes of society presupposed by Ricardo in the introduction to his book 51 Capitalists, Wage Workers, and Rentiers. 52 The abstract average profit cannot be a manifestation if is not posited by phenomenal agents, many capitals free to interact, in competition. This cannot be mere illustration, but needs to develop categories. Interest itself as the natural fruit of the thing capital cannot be conceived, if the idea of an average gain of capital, average profit, has not become common sense among acting capitalists. Also crises and cycles have to be sketched. Moreover, how can capitalistic phenomenal life be described without credit and share fictitious capital? What is the relationship between real accumulation and fictitious accumulation? Summarizing, to draw an outline, even at a very abstract level, of how capitalistic phenomenal dynamics work, more than universality is required. It was then theoretically necessary to return to lower levels of abstraction. What is worth emphasizing is that an analysis of these topics, lower levels of abstraction, after capital and profit is not a new plan. It is simply F, except for accumulation and total social reproduction. Also including rent after capital is not new, it is D. We have, then, the return of U, P, S within the framework of manifestation. Despite this return, the structure essence/manifestation remain the basic framework of this final exposition. This is why the old categories were not mentioned anymore, they did not represent the principal outline. Problems Marx's 1864-5 manuscript for Volume 3 remained unfinished. He more persistently tried to finish Volume 2,53 while for Volume 3 we have only a few materials, no general reconsideration, just special manuscripts for specific topics. 54 This manuscript is then, on the one hand, the only substantial reference point for this part of the theory, Volume 3, and, on the other hand, a draft, with many unaccomplished parts, in particular the ones I've been referring to so far. In the end, it turned out to be a mix of two plans and this caused a few problems. A book on capital in general was twisted to include, not as illustrations but organically, topics from lower levels of abstraction. Even if they followed Marx's old ideas, in a few cases he was not able to show the mediation between different parts, therefore, expositions of connected topics at different levels of abstraction lay next to one another without sufficient mediation. I think that at least two of the most controversial points scholars have been debating about for more than a century derive from these inconsistencies. 1. The transformation problem. We have paragraph 2, chapter 9 in Engels's edition, at the level of abstraction of capital in general. In fact, competition plays no role for the calculation of the average profit, we have just an algebraic sum and division. Competition is here just a label and, significantly, the term barely occurs, 2 times, referring to the equalization process, which is actually the subject of the next paragraph. The realization of products plays no role and there is no market value. Values and prices diverge. Paragraph 3, Chapter 10 in Engels's edition, is on the contrary an analysis of how the two competitions, within one branch and among branches, produce market values and then production prices thanks to a long-run trend to equalization, where commodity realization is essential. Here there is no divergence between market values and prices, because production prices are nothing but an average to which market prices tend in the long run, they never cease to realize approximately their market values. We have then, next to each other, two paragraphs that belong to different levels of abstraction and no mediation. 2. The second case regards the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. In the first part we have this tendency explained on the basis of the increase of the organic composition of capital. We don't need any realization of commodities to understand that, because we know from the first volume that there is an intrinsic trend in capital gradually to invest more in constant capital. This is a process that can be studied in its pure form, setting competition apart. In the second part, we can find a sketched theory of economic cycles, where concepts emerge for which competition is crucial, such as crisis, overproduction, and so on. Here the fall of the rate of profit is due to the impossibility of selling commodities produced. The two parts are at different levels, but, again, no real mediation is given. Point 55. As for the general outline, further questions concern the final section on credit and fictitious capital. As I said, Engels's edition deeply misled the interpretation of this part, since he transformed the general title of the final section of capital theory into the title of just one chapter next to many others, most of which were nothing but Engels's creation. In spite of the unfinished status of this part, it is clear what Marx wanted to deal with in most of the text, chapters 28 to 32 in Engels's edition, the relationship between real and fictitious accumulation, and a sketch of a theory of the economic cycle which could take into account both accumulations, real and fictitious, and their mutual feedback. This is what he once called singularity. It is very important to point out that in this manuscript, 1864-5, Marx wrote for the first time the final part of his theory of capital according to the plans written in 1857-8. Finally, the position of rent after capital is not new at all. It corresponds again to the plans of 1857-8. The difference is that rent is analyzed only for what relates to the general theory of surplus value, in particular for its connection with the average profit. As for the other books on competition, credit, and fictitious capital, what was added in the end was not their entire exposition, but only their more abstract aspects, inasmuch as they were connected with the general theory of capital. This is what he needed to outline capital's phenomenal dynamics at the highest level of abstraction. Conclusion. We have seen, first, how Marx started with a generic dialectical outline of the concept of capital, U.P.S. Secondly, because of the intrinsic consistency of the concept of universality, he made some changes that resulted in a dialectically more consistent framework of it. Thirdly, at a certain point Marx seemed to give up not the old project, but the idea he could entirely realize it. He wanted to treat only capital in general, articulated on two levels, essence and manifestation. However, this new model turned out not to be consistent without the introduction of at least the most abstract elements of more concrete levels of abstraction, competition, credit, and fictitious capital, and rent. Therefore, the old project re-emerged in the new one. What is Hegelian about this? First, the idea that an intrinsic necessity lies inside things. If a scientist wants to make sense of them, he or she has to let their internal logic develop, the Auslegung der Sache selbst. Marx, like many others of his generation, thought that, according to Hegel, this was the way the idea created the material world. This was his idealism. According to Marx, it was instead just the way the scientific laws were reproduced in thought. Today we know that Marx's criticism is untenable and that this translation of real into thought is much closer to Hegel's attitude than he could imagine. On the other side, we have a consistent presence of the triad U.P.S. It is not an application of these categories to political economy. The concept of capital itself demonstrated its intrinsic dialectical nature and showed in its self-exposition that it has a structure that corresponded to those categories. These are, the process of positing its presuppositions, universality, the free interaction of many particular capitals that individually try to realize their universal law, self-valorization, particularity, particular capitals that in their singular existence incarnate the universal nature of capital, pure self-valorization, the bank as material agent of interest-bearing capital, they stay as existing universals in front of all other different particular types of capitals, which borrow money. Capital for their undertakings, singularity. Chapter 7 Lost in Translation. Once again on the Marx, Hegel connection. Riccardo Bellofiore Introduction. This chapter will deal in steps with the Marx, Hegel connection in Capital. The first step, section 1, will be to survey the most relevant positions in shaping the writer's own views. The second step, in 2 sections, will be to review Marx's criticisms of Hegel, section 2, and then to consider the debate within the International Symposium on Marxian Theory, ISMT, section 3. The third step will be to argue that it is exactly Hegel's idealism which made the Stuttgart philosopher crucial for the understanding of the capital relation. This third step is divided into 3 sections. Initially, section 4, I shall consider Coletti's reading of Marx cum Hegel, and also some converging considerations by Backhaus in his perspective on the dialectic of the form of value. I shall then present my own interpretation, showing how the movement from commodity to money, and then to capital, must be understood as following a dual path. The first path, section 5, reconstructs the circularity of capital as subject, as an automatic fetish. It is here that Hegel's idealistic method of positing the presupposition served Marx well. The second path, section 6, leads us to dig into the constitution of the capital relation, and therefore into the linear exploitation of workers and class struggle in production. Here we meet Marx's radical break from Hegel, and understand the materialist foundation of the critique of political economy. 1. 3 ways of looking at dialectics. In recent decades, the relationship between Marx and Hegel has been at the center of attention. Let us start from the meaning of the term critique in Marx's Critique of Political Economy. Alfred Schmidt remarked that for Marx there are no social facts in themselves which can be apprehended through traditional discipline boundaries. The real object of knowledge is the social phenomenon as a whole, hence capital as totality. But this latter must be understood not as if the empirically given conditions of production are the immediate object of knowledge. Theory and its objective content are related, but they are not one and the same. The method of inquiry, Schmidt explains, deals with material from history, economics, sociology, statistics, and so on, and through the isolating and analyzing of understanding. The method of presentation, in contrast, has to bring concrete unity to these isolated data. Presentation Darstellian proceeds from immediate being to mediating essence, which is the ground of being. Essential reality must appear erschienen, but this concrete instantiation of essence is distinguished from its manifestation. Point 1. If Schmidt stresses the epistemological role of dialectics by showing the interconnection of objects and concepts, Roberto Finelli insists that appearance, while exhibiting Darstellian essence. 1 Schmidt 1968. Later in this chapter I shall question some ambiguities and errors in the English translations of some of Marx's basic categories. In these first sections, more devoted to a personal survey of the literature, I prefer to maintain the terminology used by the authors I am considering, or adopted by their translators. I limit myself to inserting in parentheses the German for those nouns or verbs which are more relevant for the discussion in the later sections of the chapter. Fundamentally distorts it. Point 2. The method of capital is the positing of the presuppositions. Point 3. We encounter here a second role for dialectics, that of an active dissimulation of the inner essence by the outer surface. This positing of the presupposition must be framed in Hegelian terms. Capital is indeed an invisible subject in a kind of perennial movement in a circle. Value valorizing itself is a closed totality, where labor is reduced to labor power. No element escapes the power of the totalizing subject. The logic of dissimulation proper to this all-encompassing subject does not allow us to speak properly of a logic of contradiction. Thus, the first perspective has stressed the essence/appearance distinction, the second perspective the totalitarian circularity of capital. Between the two, Another role for dialectics may be discerned as concretion, concretization, a movement of systematic exposition Darstellian, moving from simple and abstract categories to more complex and concrete notions. In this third perspective on dialectics, every category is redefined at each stage or layer of the theoretical discourse, so that there are many conceptual transformations. We meet again a circle, since the comprehension of what is more complex and concrete has to have an effect on the more simple and abstract notion. The possibility is, however, open to read this dialectical deduction in a stronger way, a fourth perspective, that is, as the progressive movement of the concepts themselves, progressively instantiating and appropriating social reality. Dialectics here stands somehow between the question of the systematic organization of the presentation and the question of the systematic generation of capital itself as a subject, or rather, as we see, capital as subject, to Marx contra Hegel. If one takes the line that systematic dialectics has to do just with the conceptual exhibition of the categories, Hegelian method is compatible with a kind of realist metaphysics. If one takes the line that systematic dialectics has to do with capital as a self-sustaining ideal reality, the usual reading of Hegel as an idealist seems to pose no problem at all. The issue is relevant because most contemporary Hegelian readings of Marx by Marxists run against Marx's very explicit criticisms of Hegel. We meet at least three of them. The first is his 1843 criticisms of Hegel's philosophy of right, where the attack is on Hegel identifying being and thought. The empirical realm is transformed into a moment of the idea, and reason pretends to transform itself into real, particular, and corporeal subjects. The abstraction is made substance, hypostatization, the universal becomes an entity existing in its own right. We have here at the same time the reproduction of a Feuerbachian inversion of subject and predicate. The universal concept that should express the predicate of some subject is instead seen as the subject of which the actual subject is the predicate. In the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, Marx argued that Hegel, first, identified objectification and estrangement, so that overcoming estrangement meant overcoming objectivity, and, second, identified objectivity and alienation, because the positing as objective cannot escape alienation itself, which is a necessary phase for self-consciousness recognizing in the object nothing but self-alienation. For the first side, Hegel grants true reality only to the idea, and for the second side, he sees in the empirical reality nothing but a momentary incarnation of the idea itself. A second criticism is the one included in the introduction to the economic manuscripts of 1857–58. Hegel confuses the order of knowledge with the order of reality. The concretum as substratum is always presupposed, but it is necessary to take into account the double movement between the abstract and the concrete. The mode of inquiry concerns the transition from the concrete of sensible materiality, appropriated analytically, to the abstract logical forms, which have to be sequentially and synthetically exhibited. Marx fully endorses Hegel on the need to ascend from the abstract to the concrete. Knowledge is no mere description, it is genetic exposition Darstellian, the exhibition of the whole and the understanding of the effectual constitution of the whole. The concrete is the concentration of many determinations, hence unity of the difference, it is a result. But Hegel is cutting out the first half of this epistemological circle, where the concrete is the point of departure in reality, that is, in observation and representation Vorstellian. Hegel is conflating the order of knowledge with the order of reality. The third criticism of Marx's is in the afterword to the 1873 second edition of Capital Volume I. Marx defines his dialectical method as the opposite of Hegel's, in that for him the ideal is nothing else than the material world reflected in the mind of man, and translated into forms of thought. Point 4 Dialectics leads to the positive understanding of what exists, but also to a simultaneous recognition of its negation, its inevitable destruction. Point 5 It regards every historically developed social form as being in a fluid state, in motion, and therefore grasps its transient aspect as well, and because it does not let itself be impressed by anything, being in its very essence critical and revolutionary. Point 6. Unfortunately, in Hegel, who presented it for the first time in its general form of operation, dialectics stands on its head, and must be turned right side up again. In order to discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. Point 73. Some positions in the ISMT debate. A consensus among all the ISMT authors is that Marx is a systematic dialectician, that is, he proposes the articulation of categories to conceptualize an existent concrete whole. For Roberto Feinske, Geert Rutten and Tony Smith there is another point of agreement, in that for these three authors Marx's criticisms of Hegel's idealism are misdirected regarding the systematic dialectical method. For Smith, systematic dialectics helps in the reflective clarification of the categories used in empirical social science, and allows us to unveil capitalist fetishism. Point 8. Moreover, distinguishing between what is necessary and what is contingent, it grounds revolutionary politics by pointing towards the transformation of fundamental structures. Marx did not realize that his criticisms only attacked Hegel's quite extravagant terminology and indulgence in picture thinking. On the method there was no substantial disagreement. Both authors think that a category is a principle unifying different particulars, and that universal and individuals are reconciled, unity of identity in difference. Argument begins from an immediate, and inadequate, simple unity, an abstract universality, therefore this moment has to give way to a moment where difference is emphasized, now making unity implicit. The negation of simple unity develops into the emergence of real difference. This dialectical positing of difference is sublated into a complex unity in difference that incorporates the moment of difference, and is thus a negation of the negation. The dialectical argument moves through the positing and overcoming of contradictions, which are nothing but the tension between what a category inherently is and what it explicitly is. The truth, the result reached in this way, can be a category of simple unity looked at from a higher level perspective. It is a new determinate starting point. The movement goes on with an internal, immanent, necessary deduction in the process of concretion. Smith's Hegel does not deny the independence of the real process, nor the presence in reality of an irreducible residue of contingency. More than that, the content for the movement of categorical determinations is not self-generated, though the transitions are indeed self-acting, the meaning being that the conceptual movement is justified by the objective content of each category. Absolute spirit, idea, is definitely not a metaphysical subject. Capital is architectonically structured on a systematic dialectical logic. Smith's strategy seems to be to see nothing but Hegel in Marx's 1857-8 introduction, and to locate the point of intersection within capital read as the logic of essence. There are three fundamental ontological, formal, structures in Hegel's science of logic. Being sen is simple unity, aggregating isolated and self-contained entities. Essence wesen, the principle of unity connecting them together, subsumes these entities. It may, however, reduce different unities to mere appearances, leaving the risk of fragmentation, and maintaining the separation between the two poles. Concept Begriff is instead an ontological structure of unity in difference which mediates harmoniously the different individuals and the common unity. Marx, according to Smith, builds on the second level of science of logic, without a one-to-one mapping. The commodity is abstract labor 9 in an alienated form. Fetishism permeates the commodity, fetishism meaning that sociality cannot present itself as what it essentially is, a relation within society, but rather appears only as a relation among things. Sociality cannot thus appear as what it truly is, instead, it necessarily appears in alien form. The logic of sociality is opposed to the, equally valid, but more superficial, logic proper to value/money. The development of this line of thought leads Smith to affirm that capital is a pseudo-subject, nothing but the collective creative powers of living labor. The self-valorization of capital is nothing but the expropriation of those powers. Rutten's approach has some similarities to Smith's, and it is based on a thorough criticism of empiricism. In the Grundriss Marx experiments with Hegel's logic of the concept, that is, the subjective logic, but he abandoned this attempt in Capital, rather following the logic of essence. Starting from an abstract characterization of the totality, Rutten and Williams indicate how the grounding of that starting point goes along with a gradual conceptual concretization of the totality. Point 10 Grounding the conditions of existence at ever more concrete levels will require the recurrent transcending of the opposition of moments in new necessary moments and concepts, but at some point also the introduction of contingent moments, for Rutten and Smith, the form of value and its transformations are the structure whereby dissociated and private labors are expended and then made social in exchange. Both reconstruct capitalism within a kind of macro-social holism, whereby the whole grounds and limits microeconomic individual behaviors. The dialectics comes down to a philosophical foundation with the primacy given to epistemology. Feinsky insists that Marx used methodologically the logic of the concept, where being and essence are nothing but the concept while it is in development. Point 11 This notwithstanding, many of his observations converge with Rutten's and Smith's. Feinsky sees in Capital an articulation of four levels of abstraction. After a kind of basic first level, simple circulation as presupposition, the second level is generality/universality, which shows how capital becomes in production and circulation. In his later writings, Marx included in capital as a whole also the many capitals and accumulation. A third level is particularity, which deals with one/many capitals in competition. The many capitals are now understood as particular capitals in their dynamic of self-valorization. A fourth and final level is singularity. It deals, among other things, with interest-bearing capital, where the universality of capital exists as a particular existing capital, and it is therefore singular. Like Rutten and Smith, he confines Marx's debt to Hegel to the methodological level only. Like Rutten and Smith, Feinsky finds untenable Marx's reading of Hegel as idealist. We find something different with Patrick Murray and Chris Arthur. Both authors see clearly the significance of the charge of idealism leveled by Marx against Hegel, and Hegel's logic. Murray asserts that if we examine Hegel's characterization of the concept, and compare it to Marx's description of capital, it seems clear that the absolute, self-realizing logic of the Hegelian concept resembles the movement of capital. Point 12 Marx shared with Hegel an approach based on an immanent logic of theory, but Hegel put logic before experience. Hegel identified processes in thought and real processes, whereas Marx insisted on an independently existing world. Moreover, Hegel's abstractions were general, Marx's were mostly determinate. Even more relevant, the opposition of essence and appearance must not be mediated, as Hegel maintains, but uprooted, as Marx rightly retorts. Marx's reasoning is inextricably linked to the twin dynamics of hypostatization and inversion, capital as an automatic subject, as an encompassing übergreifend subject of the whole process, as a self-moving and self-activating substance. Value is a thing like substance, and as capital it really transmutes into a subject. The logic of capital, and not only the logic of capital, is the logic of Hegel, as the logic of absolute idealism, because of the isomorphism between the capital fetish as a totality and the unfolding of the idea. We are here beyond a merely methodological reading of systematic dialectics. Point 13 Arthur insists that the debt Marx owes to Hegel is not just the epistemological, immanent logic of science built upon the insistence that presentation Darstellian must show the logical necessity for the dual nature of the commodity to unfold the ever more complex forms of capitalist political economy. There is that too, of course, theory faces an existing totality, and analyzing its isolated moments would lead to a very limited and distorted understanding. The moments must be located in the whole, with the systematic progression of categories allowing us, as in Smith, to apprehend object domains of increasing complexity, the progression itself being driven, as in Rutten, by the consideration that any category under consideration is deficient in determinacy with respect to the next. It is exactly this deficiency to be overcome, the limits of the category, which provides the impulse to a transition, to a determination of a further category, in a sequence enriching each category and moving towards the concrete. This is peculiarly relevant because, as the reference to the understanding of universal monetary exchange leading to value form, S, shows very well, the capitalist system is, in part, made of logical relations. Capital is actually, and up to a point, an ideal reality. But the other half of the story is that Hegel is relevant for Marx not in spite of, but rather because of his idealist ontology. Capital is a very peculiar object, grounded in a process of real abstraction in exchange in much the same way as Hegel's dissolution and reconstruction of reality is predicated on the abstractive power of thought. It is in this sense that it may be shown that there is a connection between Hegel's infinite and Marx's capital. Point 14 The isomorphism between Hegel's logic and the actuality of capital is valid, and, Arthur concludes, the homology with the idea is precisely a reason for criticizing it as an inverted reality where self-moving abstractions have the upper hand over human beings. The point to be noted, however, is that for the substance of value genuinely to become the spiral of capital, as value creating more value, as money augmented with more money, capital must enter the non-ideal realm of the transformation of use values, the hidden abode of production, and subsume, not only formally but also really, labor as its living internal other, nature being the external other. Capital is defined in terms of its irresolvable opposition to labor, but it has found ways to atomize and demobilize it. This resolution of its basic internal contradiction, though temporary and contingent, as Rutten would say, characterizes a whole epoch, a whole mode of production. But capital remains limited and liable to overthrow, labor remains a counter-subject, virtually present, if empirically not effective except in some partial way. My approach is very similar to Arthur's. A key influence for me has been Coletti, particularly his innovative, and Rubinian, reading of value theory in his 1968 introduction to Bernstein, the year after collected in From Rousseau to Marx and the last two chapters of his 1969 Marxism and Hegel. Point 15 The last chapter of the latter, in particular, the idea of bourgeois Christian society, parallels many of Murray's and Arthur's arguments. Before going deeper into this, however, I want to remove from the table what I think is a red herring, the issue of the nature of Hegel's idealism, and even more so the question of whether Marx was unfair in his criticism of the Stuttgart philosopher. My opinion is similar to Suchting's in an unpublished paper of his on Hegel's Science of Logic as Logic of Science. Point 16 Hegel grasped better than anyone before him, and better than most after him, the fundamental features of modern scientific inquiry. His method, however, was fundamentally idealist. But I am not a Hegel expert, I could be fundamentally wrong here. This is mostly irrelevant. Because what is important to the topic at hand is that Hegel's Science of Logic was essential for the mature Marx exactly because its idealism accurately reflects the idealist and totalitarian nature of capitalist circularity of capital as money begetting money. To put it bluntly, even if Marx's Hegel is not the real Hegel, it is the fake Hegel that matters. At the same time, the thesis of a strict homology between Hegel and Marx cannot be stretched too far. More than being grounded in a formal replication of the U.P.'s structure mapping a one-to-one correspondence between the three volumes of Capital and Science of Logic, the homology I am insisting upon is built, and dissolved, in the first 7 chapters of Volume I, and relates capital as subject to absolute idea as subject. For Lucio Coletti and Hans-Georg Backhaus on Marx cum Hegel Hegel's absolute idealism amounts to God becoming real in the world, to his presence in the modern and bourgeois civil and political institutions, so that these historical realities are in fact mystical objects. Point 17 However strange it may seem, this is precisely the point where Marx's work and Hegel's coincide. Just as the institutions of the bourgeois world are sensuous incarnations of the supersensible, or in other words positive expositions of the absolute, so too in Capital the commodity has a mystical character. It is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. To quote Marx directly. Point 18 Marx sees in capitalist reality a world turned upside down. Abstract human labor is like the abstract man of Christianity. Value, social unity becoming an object, leads to the paradox of the social bond as a self-positing relationship that posits itself independently of the individuals whom it ought to relate and mediate between. It is a relationship becoming a thing which, posited outside individuals, dominates them like God, though it is their own estranged social power. The commodity is a use-value, a thing, concealing in itself a non-material objectivity, value. The commodity, just like the Christian, is the unity of the finite and the infinite, the unity of opposites, being and non-being together. 19 In fact, it is the same Marx who emphasizes that the commodity is and is not a use-value. The dialectic of matter is confirmed as the logic of this upside-down world. Behind the relative exchange value there is a real absolute or intrinsic value, existing in the related things themselves, namely, a hypostatization of value. Marx, horrible dictu, accepts the argument that value is a metaphysical entity, and merely confines himself to noting that it is the thing, i.e. the commodity itself or value, that is the scholastic entity. His contradictions are innate in the subject matter, not in its verbal expression. This society based on capital and commodities is therefore the metaphysics, the fetishism, the mystical world, even more so than Hegel's logic itself. 20 The world of commodities and capital is a mystical one, even more so than Hegel's logic itself. The discourse could not be clearer. The commodity as the materialization of labor, that is, as value, has an imaginary, purely social existence. The abstract universal, which ought to be the property of the concrete, becomes a self-subsisting entity and an active subject, with the concrete and sensuous counting only as the form of manifestation of the abstract universal, the predicate of its own substantialized predicate. For Coletti, Hegel's dialectical logic is nothing but the peculiar method for the peculiar object, precisely due to his absolute idealism. The philosophical critique of Hegel and the critical political economy of capitalism, in Capital as well as in the Grundrisse, are one and the same. Backhaus arrives at very similar conclusions in his paper on Marx's revolutionizing and critique of economic theory, the determination of their objects as a totality of deranged forms. 21 Marx attributes to the objective legality of society not only a contradictory character but irrationality. The realm of the verrucht Formen, the deranged forms, where this displacement alludes at the same time to craziness and perversion, is there from the start, at the beginning of Capital, and does not come into being only in Volume 3. The not yet developed form of exchange value is already a mystification of reality, which, however, is the appearance of things as they are. It is a manifestation, an Erscheinung, not a semblance, a shine. More on this later in this chapter. It is capitalist reality itself which is paradoxical. The two fundamental ideas of Marx's dialectical development in value theory are very simple for Backhaus. 22 First, a contradiction in the commodity itself is found, the contradiction of being at the same time use value and value, sensible and supersensible. Second, only as money is the commodity really a commodity. The true question which gives its specificity to Marx's critique of political economy is opened from here: how the value thing, as commodity, money, capital, the fetish, is constituted from a human basis, that is, how the social, superindividual substance which is value develops into a form which presents itself as something over and beyond human beings. The relationship between substance and form, or between essence and appearance, must be thought of as a necessary interconnection, as a non-identity which is at the same time an identity. Essence must appear, this is an Erscheinung, but this appearance is a distortion, everything appears upside down. Since, in general exchange, things present themselves in a non-material connection, commodities hide a phantom mode of existence. For Backhaus, as for Coletti, this peculiar object requires a peculiar science to investigate it. Like Coletti, Backhaus quotes Marx on Bailey, according to whom the paradoxes of speech just reflect a paradox of reality itself. 23 Essence must manifest itself, but this manifestation is not the essence, because this appearance Erscheinung is a reversal Umkehrung and an inversion Verkehrung. The phenomenon, or form, is a material, distorting veil which conceals at the same time that which it paradoxically reveals. Before going on, I have to alert the reader to the convention I will adopt in the following regarding the translation of some Hegelian terms structuring Marx's discourse. Point 24 Shine has to do with the phenomena at the surface when they are considered in themselves as the essence. As such, this explanation of capitalist reality may be illusory and vulgar, a mere semblance. Erscheinung has to do with those same phenomena as they appear or present themselves. It is the necessary manifestation of the essence, the way the latter cannot but appear at the phenomenal level. But in Marx it is at the same time a perverted and crazy manifestation of the essential laws, hence the derangement of the verrucht Formen. Here I translate as appearance or manifestation a determination with an element of self-subsistence. The essence manifests itself by virtue of an exhibition, a presentation, a Darstellung. This term is very often translated as representation. Though I used representation in the past, now I very much prefer exhibition, exactly because it is less mundane and more technical, thus helping to realize Marx's dialectical jargon. It also makes it easier to understand that this presentation is not in labor hours but in money. It is the processual exposition of the system which is necessary from the point of view of the logical reconstruction of the whole. If what is exhibited is recognized as such, as a result of a complex process of mediation, then it is an appearance, a manifestation; if otherwise, it is a semblance or illusion. However, as I shall show later, in Capital all this cannot be reduced to something closed inside the mind of the philosopher doing science and looking at the self-development of the subject matter itself. As Feinske puts it. Point 25 Vorstellung is rendered by me as a mental or notional representation, it is an ideal anticipation, or the way agents grasp capitalist forms. I interpret Ausdrucken in a stronger way than usual, it is to express, as referring to a movement from the inner, as a latent or potential reality, to the outer, the objectified form. In fact, it is the genetic process constituting the Darstellung. Point 26.5 Marx after Hegel, the fetish character of capital versus fetishism. Let me go back, and reconstruct the dialectics of value, money, and capital. The commodity presents itself Darstellung from the start as a dual entity, it is a use value, a product with some utility, and has an exchange value, a quantitative relationship with other commodities. It seems that the notion of an intrinsic or absolute value is then a contradictionary in adjecto, but this is a mere illusion. Shine. Behind this first definition of exchange value we must detect value, the real duality is between use value and value. This duality within the commodity, as the result of the productive process, corresponds to a duality in the labor producing it, in the activity. The expenditure of labor power, or the living labor performed by workers, can be seen as dual to, as concrete labor, inasmuch as it produced the commodity as use value, and as abstract labor, inasmuch as it produces value. Note that use values and concrete labors are non-homogeneous, thus incommensurable. Value, on the contrary, is a gelatine Gallert of labor pure and simple, a homogeneous amount, which is commensurable as such. Its definition as a gelatine relates objectified labor to living labor as a fluid. This idea of value as the objectified congelation of the abstract living labor of human beings, value commodities are exhibited by one excluded commodity performing the role of the universal equivalent, the process of Darstellung. When this role becomes customarily and politically fixed to one commodity, the universal equivalent is money. The money form, originating from form C, that is, the universal equivalent form, sublates, that is, conserves and transcends, form A, the elementary form of value, and form B, the total form of value. Money is nothing but a Hegelian syllogism made actual. Money as a commodity is produced by labor. Marx mostly refers to gold. Once a definite commodity has been selected to play the role of the universal equivalent, the ghost has been able to take possession of a body. The Gothic undertone is more than merely rhetorical. Money is literally a value embodied verkorperter word in the use value of gold. Note that in general, labor is embodied in commodities only as concrete labor, not as abstract labor, all the current translations in any language notwithstanding, with their wild uses of embodiment everywhere. As for abstract labor, Marx says, it is rather contained enthalten in commodities. Since money as a commodity is value embodied, the abstract labor contained in the commodities exchanged against that money is also exhibited in the concrete labor embodied in gold. In other terms, the exhibition of commodities abstract labor requires the embodiment Verkörperung of the concrete labor producing gold as money. Exchange value has thus developed into a second definition. It is not just the exchange ratio between any two commodities but rather the amount of each of them that is exchanged for some amount of money. Note what money is for Marx. It is not just the universal equivalent, validating ex post the abstract labor which is immediately private and only immediately social. Money is also and primarily the individual incarnation of value resulting from social labor. Again, the Christian undertone is not merely rhetorical. As such, the labor producing gold as money is the only private labor that is at the same time immediately social labor. When Marx speaks of unmittelbargesellschaftliche Arbeit immediately social labor he always refers exclusively to the concrete labor producing money as a commodity and exhibiting the abstract labor producing the commodities to be sold on the market. This latter is a vermittelgesellschaftliche Arbeit, a social labor which is always mediated through the exchange of things. 27 By the reification which is connected to the fetish character of the capitalist mode of production and circulation. The fetish character, the objective, thing-like and alienated nature of capitalist social reality, is actually very real, an Erscheinung. What is deceptive, a semblance or shine, is to attribute social properties to the things themselves as their natural attributes. This latter is fetischismus, fetishism. But only if this is done outside of the social relation of capital. Within the capitalist reality, the social properties attached to the things are dramatically effective. 28 Measure of the magnitude of each commodity's value in money terms, as they are notionally anticipated by producers before exchange, into the imminent measure in amounts of labor time. We have now all the elements to move on to the way in which Marx determines the value of money, which is the inverse of the monetary expression of socially necessary labor time. According to Marx, the quantitative determination of the value of money is fixed at the point of production of gold, that is, at the entry point of gold as money into the circuit. Gold is exchanged at first just as a mere commodity against all other commodities. This exchange is not, strictly speaking, already monetary. The private labor time required to produce gold is equalized with the amount of private labors producing the other commodities with which gold is exchanged, so that the same amount of labor time is congealed in one and the others. This is still, Marx is explicit, immediate barter. The German here is unequivocal, unmittelbarem Tauschhandel. It is not yet circulation, which always is mediated by money, this being the meaning Marx gives to circulation, as Backhaus convincingly says. Only after it has entered the market in this way, as an immediate product of labor, at its source of production, to be exchanged with other products of labor of equal value, does gold function as money. 31 Gold as money then goes into circulation properly speaking, that is, into generalist monetary commodity exchange. From now on its value is always already given. In this perspective, the connection between value and labor is provided through money as a commodity. This is argued in steps. Value before exchange is already ideal money with a given, notional, labor content. It is a determined amount of contained labor. This substance is actualized in circulation when ideal money turns into real money. With the exhibition Darstellung of commodities value by money, not only does the concrete labor producing gold as money count as the only, immediately social labor, but we are also witnessing a movement from the inner to the outer. Within exchange on the commodity output market, objectified labor 32 is abstract because, when exhibited in the form of value, the products of human working activity manifest themselves as an independent and estranged reality divorced from their origin in living labor. The implied alienation of individuals is coupled with reification and fetishism. Reification, because social relations necessarily take the material appearance Erscheinung of an exchange between things, this is the fetish character, and fetishism, because the products of labor have the semblance shine of being endowed with social properties as if these latter were bestowed upon them by nature. These characteristics and this distinction between fetish character and fetishism will reappear in a heightened light in the other two moments of the capitalist circuit. On the labor market, human beings become the personifications of the commodity they sell, labor power or potential labor, which is the commodity of which the workers are a mere appendage. Within production, living labor itself, or labor in becoming, organized and shaped by capital as value in process, and embedded in a definite material organization for the creation of use values which is specifically designed to enforce the extraction of surplus value, is the true abstract subject of which the concrete workers performing it are just predicates. In capital and in results of the direct production process this is most clearly visible in Marx's discourse on capital's productivity, Marx's emphasis as italics, mine as bold and underlining 31. Note that Marx does not write commodity but immediate product of labor. 32. This is very often in German Gegenstand like Arbeit, see later for comment. Since living labor is already, within the production process, incorporated einverlebt into capital, the social productive powers of labor all present themselves still in dar as productive forces, as properties inherent in capital, just as in money the general character of labor, insofar as it functioned to create value, appeared erscheinen as the property of a thing. The relation becomes still more complex, and apparently scheinbar more mysterious, in that, with the development of the specifically capitalist mode of production, not only do these things, these products of labor, both as use values and as exchange values, stand on their hind legs vis-a-vis the worker and confront him as capital, but also the social forms of labor appear darstellen as forms of the development of capital, and therefore the productive powers of social labor, thus developed, appear darstellen as productive powers of capital. As such social forces they are capitalized vis-a-vis labor. The social forms of their own labor confront the workers as combinations which, unlike their isolated labor capacities, belong to capital, originate from it and are incorporated einverlebt within it. 33 and a few lines below, in this process, in which the social characteristics of their labor confront them as capitalized, to a certain extent, in the way that e.g. in machinery the visible products of labor appear erschienen as ruling over labor, the same thing of course takes place for the forces of nature and science, the product of general historical development in its abstract quintessence. They confront the workers as powers of capital. They become in fact separated from the skill and knowledge of the individual worker, and although, if we look at them from the point of view of their source, they are in turn the product of labor, they appear erschienen as incorporated einverlebt into capital wherever they enter the labor process. 34 All Marx's discourse is predicated not on semblance shine, but on manifestation Erscheinung in the exhibition Darstellung of capital. This perspective can be rebutted only if we look at this paradoxical reality from the point of view of its source, living labor coming from the exploitation of workers as living bearers of labor power. This is the critical and revolutionary discourse on the constitution of capital as the automatic fetish becoming a subject. Another note about translation is necessary here. When in capital volume I Marx uses Arbeit, labor, he always means lebendige Arbeit, labor in motion. When labor is eventually objectified in the value of the commodity 35, when it ceases to be a fluid and is congealed in a gelatine, it has morphed into dead labor. If we only look at capitalist production and circulation from that point, we remain inescapably in a Ricardian setting, as practically all Marxist economists do today. 6. Marx beyond Hegel, the constitution of the capital relation to be actually self-grounded, value must be produced by value. But dead labor cannot produce more dead labor. What is needed is that capital internalize in production the activity which may turn less dead labor into more dead labor, that is, the only otherness to dead labor, which is the living labor of human beings. This happens only when workers as bearers of Lab 35 Marx very often employs Gegenständlich and the like, which means becoming objective, the objectivity standing in front of human beings, as something which has its origin in the processual moment of labor as activity, thereby as potential living labor, become a very special commodity bought and sold on the labor market. We have already argued that commodities, as values, are a ghost-like objectivity Gegenständlichkeit. Nobody knows how to handle this value, until it takes a separate and autonomous form from the commodities themselves, money. It is only when the opposition within the commodity has become a real duality, when value as content is duplicated by value as form, that Hegel's ontological categories start to gain actuality, and value begetting value becomes the instantiation of the absolute idea. Only now not only the ghost of value has become the chrysalis as money, this money chrysalis exhibiting value has also been able to mutate into a butterfly, namely, self-valorizing value. On a systemic scale, however, this idealistic butterfly cannot but be grounded in the materiality of capital as vampire. Labor is a very complex category. It must be articulated in all its complexity. Labor power and living labor have really become capital's labor power and capital's living labor. At the same time, labor power cannot but be attached to workers as human beings, in a social relation with other workers. Workers are included in capital, dead labor, as an internal other, living labor, to borrow Chris Arthur's enlightening expression. We are meeting a new kind of embodiment. The verb here is not verkörpern, taking the body, incarnation, but einverleiben, the absorption of workers, as living bearers of labor power, and hence as the agents who have to expend human living labor as activity, into the body of capital, as the capitalistically shaped configuration of use values, of matter, so that the technological and organizational structure of the labor process becomes an adequate content for the successful valorization of money capital. Before it was a possession and incarnation, now it is internalization in the mechanical body of capital. Marx's capital as self-valorizing value is confirmed as akin to Hegel's absolute idea, seeking to actualize itself while reproducing its own entire conditions of existence. However, capital's zombie life is dependent on a social condition. Capital must win the class struggle in production, a contested terrain. It has to suck away from workers their life, so that it may come back to life as undead. Workers may resist their incorporation as internal moment of capital. This surmountable barrier or obstacle shrank may become an insurmountable limit grens, when conflict becomes antagonism. The key point is that it is not possible to have labor without pumping it out from labor power. It is not possible to use labor power without consuming the body of the workers themselves, as the living bearers of labor power. Capital produces only thanks to this very specific consumption, which creates a very specific contradiction. This is indeed the true pillar of the labor theory of value as a theory tracing the new value added produced in the period back to the living labor spent by workers. As Tomba convincingly highlights, the consumption of workers' bodies, and minds, has no possible compensation. 36 When Hegelian ontology seems to come fully into being in capitalist reality as its own realm, it turns out that it crucially hangs on capital's success in exploiting and commanding labor. Even though labor is embodied into capital, capital still cannot but depend on it. The circularity of capital, the ontological circle of positing the presupposition, has as its unconscious secret the linear process of sucking living labor in excess of the necessary labor needed to reproduce workers. The totality of capital exists only to the extent to which it constitutes a specific social relation of production, which cannot be taken for granted as if it were reproduced mechanically. The social, antagonistic relation of production opens the totality of capital, and to a certain extent breaks it. Conclusions. For 150 years after the first edition of the first volume of Capital, the translation of Marx into Ricardo lost the essential Hegelian systematic dialectic so embedded in the book. It is interesting, however, that Hegelian readings of Marx, just like the Ricardian ones, are both framed within the capital fetish argument, and never reach the argument about the constitution of that fetish. Both conflate direct dead labor and living labor. Both eschew the fluidity and antagonism which are so vividly presented in the so-called historical chapters. I end with 3 quotes from Marx showing a way out from this dead end. The first is from chapter 4 of Capital Volume I. Marx here gives the positing of the presupposition movement as the ontology of capital as automatic subject, in the circulation M, C, M, both the money and the commodity function only as different modes of existence of value itself, the money as its general mode of existence, the commodity as its particular, or, so to speak, disguised mode. It is constantly changing from one form into the other without becoming lost in the movement, it thus becomes transformed into an automatic subject, ein automatisches Subjekt. If we pin down the specific forms of appearance Erscheinungsformen assumed in turn by self-valorizing value in the course of its life, we reach the following elucidation: capital is money, capital is commodities. In truth, however, value is here the subject of a process in which, while constantly assuming the form in turn of money and commodities, it changes its own magnitude, throws off surplus value from itself considered as original value, and thus valorizes itself independently. For the movement, in the course of which it adds surplus value, is its own movement, its valorization is therefore self-valorization. Because it is value, it has acquired the occult ability to add value to itself. It brings forth living offspring, or, at the least, lays golden eggs. As the dominant subject Übergreifend subject of this process, in which it alternately assumes and loses the form of money and the form of commodities, but preserves and expands itself through all these changes, value requires above all an independent form by means of which its identity with itself may be asserted. And now, in the circulation M, C, M, value suddenly presents itself steltdar as a self-moving substance which passes through a process of its own, and for which commodities and money are both mere forms. But there is more to come. Instead of simply representing Darzustellen the relations of commodities, it now enters into a private relationship with itself, as it were. It differentiates itself as original value from itself as surplus value, just as God the Father differentiates himself from himself as God the Son, although both are of the same age and form, in fact one single person. 37 Übergreifend is translated into English as active factor, more enabling, dominant, Faux, or common to all particular forms, Ehrbar. These expressions catch only part of the meanings of the word. Marx employed this term with a double accent. The first was, as in Hegel, that of overgrasp. This is a neologism the translators of the Encyclopaedia Logic adopted to follow Hegel's positive aspect of the process of Aufhebung, that is, the speculative comprehension which reaches back and embraces within its scope the opposition of the moments in its dialectical stage. 38 As universality overgrasps particulars and individuals, in the same way thought overgrasps what is other than thought. So, the subject developing into Geist includes objectivity and subjectivity within its grasp. But the term also means overreaching and overriding, bordering on dominant, and I think these terms convey some of Marx's intention in using this word. For Reichelt these formulations confirm how Marx, rather than coquetting with Hegel, was obliged to employ a dialectically structured argument for an objective constraint, since there exists a structural identity between the Marxian notion of capital and the Hegelian notion of spirit. In Marx's thought the expansion of the concept into absolute is the adequate expression of a reality where this event is happening in analogous manner. Hegelian idealism, according to which human beings obey a despotic notion, is indeed more adequate to this inverted world than any nominalistic theory wishing to accept the universal as something subjectively conceptual. It is bourgeois society as ontology. 39 The dialectical method is as good or bad as the society to which it corresponds. It is valid only where the universality asserts itself at the expense of the individual, and it is in fact the philosophical doubling of the real inversion. The characteristic feature of materialistic dialectics is the method of withdrawal, that method has to dissolve itself as soon as its conditions of existence disappear. 40. The second quote is from Capital Volume 3, Chapter XXIV. It shows that capital as the automatic fetish, as a subject, is still there in the whole of the book, together with the connected notion of deranged forms. The quote is about interest-bearing capital, defined by Marx in chapter XXIX as the mother of every insane form Verachtform. 41. In the form of interest-bearing capital, capital appears erscheinend immediately in this form, unmediated by the production and circulation processes. Capital appears erscheinend as a mysterious and self-creating source of interest, of its own increase. The thing money, commodity, value, is now already capital simply as a thing. The result of the overall reproduction process appears erscheinend as a property devolving on a thing in itself. It is up to 39 Reichelt 1979, p. 92, p. 94, p. 97, emphasis added. Postone, 2011, after quoting the same phrases from Marx, writes in a similar vein that Marx explicitly characterizes capital as the self-moving substance that is subject. In so doing, he implicitly suggests that a historical subject in the Hegelian sense does indeed exist in capitalism, p. 8, and that the social relations that characterize capitalism are of a very peculiar sort. They possess the attributes that Hegel accords the Geist. Marx's subject is like Hegel's, it is abstract and cannot be identified with any social actors. Moreover, it unfolds temporally independent of will, p. 9. Unfortunately, Postone's perspective is hampered not only by an insufficient account of the monetary aspects of value and capital, but also by a blindness to the equally fundamental process of constitution of capital as a subject within the class struggle dimension. As a consequence, he does not see that the standpoint of labor he is so keen to criticize as totally internal to capitalism is rather, at the same time, within and against capital, and hence it is the key materialist foundation of the critique of productivism. 40. Smith, 1993a, p. 150, footnote 25, quotes Backhaus, Reichelt, Krall, Rostalski, and Klaus Hartmann, as interpreters who compared Marx's and Hegel's philosophical frameworks. Unfortunately, he does not enter into a detailed, or even cursory, for what it is worth, commentary on Backhaus and Reichelt. I have learned a lot over the years from Smith, but his reading of capital as a pseudo-subject, a notion which, I must confess, I do not find very illuminating, leads me to regret that he did not engage in a serious confrontation with the literature I am stressing here. The possessor of money, i.e. of commodities in their ever-exchangeable form, whether he wants to spend this money as money or hire it out as capital. In interest-bearing capital, therefore, this automatic fetish automatisk fetish is elaborated into its pure form, self-valorizing value, money breeding money, and in this form it no longer bears any marks of its origin. The social relation is consummated in the relationship of a thing, money, to itself. The fetish character fetish gestalt of capital and the representation Vorstellung of this capital fetish Kapitalfetisch is now complete. 42. The mystification of capital, now entered into agents' ideas about the process, does not make this upside down, perverted and crazy, deranged world less real and powerful. The last quote goes back to chapter 7 of Capital Volume I, and gives a clue from where the occult ability to add value to itself comes to capital. The use of a commodity belongs to its purchaser, and the seller of labor power, by giving his labor, does no more, in reality, than part with the use value that he has sold. From the instant he steps into the workshop, the use value of his labor power, and therefore also its use, which is labor, belongs to the capitalist. By the purchase of labor power, the capitalist incorporates Einverlebt labor, as a living agent of fermentation, into the lifeless constituents of the product, which also belongs to him. By turning his money into commodities which serve as the building materials for a new product, and as factors in the labor process, by incorporating living labor power lebendige Arbeitskraft Einverlebt into their lifeless objectivity, the capitalist simultaneously transforms value, i.e., past labor in its objectified and lifeless form, into capital, value which can perform its own valorization process, an animated monster which begins to work, as if its body were by love possessed. 43. We see clearly the tension between the two sides of the coin, a tension which the translation downplays, translating as living labor, the activity actualizing labor power, what in the original is living labor power, the workers being bearers of that labor power, and really performing that activity. One truth is that the labor of the workers is of capital. But there is another truth, that labor cannot but be the work of the workers themselves. The reference to the living ferment and the consumption of workers, and the insistence on the living labor power which is embodied, included in the animated monster, points towards an unresolved and still open class contradiction. The scientific and revolutionary point of view of Marx is that bourgeois truth may be proved false, socially and politically, from a point of view which expresses another reality, the one according to which capital is the product of living labor, which is nothing but the activity of living bearers of labor power. We have to deal with two antagonistic ontologies. Marxian theory should be engaged in a reconstruction/interpretation of capital that cannot be separated from the effort of proving that, Hegelian and Ricardian, circular views about capitalism are false, in practice. Chapter 8 The Secret of Capital's Self-Valorization laid bare, how Hegel helped Marx to overturn Ricardo's theory of profit. Patrick Murray. At the core of Marx's Capital lies his revelation of capital's secret, how capital makes money out of money, or, in Marx's more technical language, how value is valorized. In Marx's theory of surplus value, capital's secret is laid bare: money makes money by appropriating, without needing to violate commercial fair play, the unpaid labor of wage workers. Marx's theory of surplus value begins his complex theory of profit, which overturns both Ricardo's theory of profit and his individualistic theory of value. Profit includes incomes in the forms of profit of enterprise, interest, and rent. The total annual profit is the sum of those incomes for the year. Profit, and another basic capitalist social form, wages, keep capital's secret well hidden. Profit measures itself against the sum of money invested. The ratio of the two sums, of profit to investment, is the rate of profit. The rate of profit, then, appears to have nothing to do with what part of the investment goes to pay wages, much less with how much unpaid labor a capital appropriates. And this is not merely a matter of appearances. The action of competition among capitals all chasing higher rates of profit tends to bring about a general rate of profit, so the size of individual profits is determined by the size of the individual capital invested. Since capital per se appears as the variable determining profit, capital seems to valorize itself. A general rate of profit implies that the profit returned to an individual investment in fact bears no direct relationship to the fraction of the investment devoted to wages or to the unpaid labor appropriated through that investment. Turning to the wage, it presents itself as compensation for the labor done by a wage worker, as the price of labor. That appearance puts a stop to the thought that profit arises from unpaid labor. There isn't any. The appearances and realities involved with profits and wages seem to torpedo Marx's claim that the source of profit is unpaid labor, and with it his theory of exploitation. But, as Marx was fond of saying in the face of an impasse, let us consider the matter more closely. In order to overturn the extant theories of profit and wages, Marx has to introduce two key distinctions, between labor and labor power and between constant and variable capital, and to revolutionize, in a second way, the classical labor theory of value. Marx had already put the labor theory of value on a new conceptual basis by identifying value as a historically specific social form. In a contribution to the Critique, Marx writes, "The labor which posits exchange value is a specific social form of labor." 1 With this conception of value as the consequence of the peculiar social character of commodity-producing labor, which necessarily appears as money, Marx reveals one of capitalism's secrets. Value is something strictly social, and money is the displaced social form of commodity-producing labor, although it is thus correct to say that exchange value is a relation between persons. It is however necessary to add that it is a relation hidden by a material veil. Point 2. That material veil is money and the price system. By revealing money to be the necessary expression of value, Marx demonstrates that money, though a physical object with distinct properties, represents nothing but a material expression of a specific social form of labor. Point 3. To solve the conundrums that the general rate of profit poses for the classical labor theory of value, Marx first argues that the labor theory of value is false at the level of individual commodities and capitals. Marx responds not by abandoning a labor theory of value, that would be to give up on scientific understanding. Rather, he reconstitutes value theory, directing it at the level of the totality of commodities and prices, capitals and profits, and, by implication, their representative or aliquot parts. Political economy's failure to reconcile the theory of value with the formation of a general rate of profit, like its tin ear for the social specificity of value and value-producing labor, is not accidental. Inattention to matters of form show its confinement to the bourgeois horizon. Marx's term bourgeois horizon refers to the mindset that was the target of his criticisms of the philosophy and economics of Proudhon's book The Philosophy of Poverty. Point 4. Of classical political economy, Marx writes, yet even its best representatives remained more or less trapped in the world of illusion their criticism had dissolved, and nothing else is possible from the bourgeois standpoint. They all fell therefore more or less into inconsistencies, half-truths and unresolved contradictions. Point 5. In the patterns of bourgeois thinking, Marx finds knots of unworkable bifurcations: mind versus world, form versus content, passive versus active, immediate versus mediated. These dualisms arise from the dogma that whatever can be distinguished in thought can exist separately. The bourgeois mindset is always looking to factor out the purely subjective from the purely objective, pure form from pure content. Hegel taught Marx to recognize and transcend the limitations of the bourgeois horizon, though Marx judged that Hegel ran afoul of his own criticisms of that mindset. Point 6. At the age of 19, Marx wrote to his father about how, after gulping in Hegel, he understood the reason for the breakdown of his attempt to write a book on jurisprudence from the standpoint of Kant and Fichte. Marx explains, the mistake lay in my believing that the one, form, could and must be developed in separation from the other, matter, and consequently I obtained no actual form, but only a desk with drawers in which I then strew sand. Point 7. By contrast, Marx discovered, in Hegel's concept, an alternative to the bifurcations of the bourgeois mindset. The concept is indeed the mediating between form and content. Point 8. Through Hegel, Marx developed the logical chops to overturn the classical theories of value and profit. Of particular importance was Hegel's logic of essence. Essence must appear as led Marx to break with Ricardo's theory of value and conclude that value must appear as money. Point 10. In the present chapter, I argue that Marx leans on Hegel's logic of essence again. Surplus value must appear as profit. Profit is the transformed form of surplus value. Point 11. In a letter to Engels of January 16, 1858, Marx writes, in the midst of work on the Grundrisse, I am getting some nice developments. For instance, I have thrown over the entire doctrine of profit as previously conceived. In the method of treatment, the fact that by mere accident I have again glanced through Hegel's logic has been of great service to me. Marx follows up, if there should ever be time for such work again, I should greatly like to make accessible to the ordinary human intelligence, in 2 or 3 printers' sheets, what is rational in the method which Hegel discovered but at the same time enveloped in mysticism. Mystifiziert hat. Point 12. Let us look further into each of these provocative points. Marx says that, with the aid of the rational aspect of the method that Hegel mystified, he has overthrown the entire doctrine of profit as previously conceived. Marx's statement naturally raises several questions, which I will try to answer in order. 1. What did Marx mean by his statement that Hegel mystified his method? 2. What did Marx find to be rational in Hegel's method? 3. What were the shortcomings of the previous conceptions of profit? 4. What were the nice developments that Marx made? 5. How did reacquainting himself with Hegel's science of logic help Marx to make these advances? 1. How, according to Marx, Did Hegel mystify his own method? What did Marx mean by Hegel's mystification of his method? Let me indicate several aspects of Hegel's method, as Marx understood it, that he would have considered mystifying. 1. Marx objected to Hegel for making logic into a discipline directed at freestanding logical entities. For Marx, this Platonist understanding of logical entities reifies what are properly conceived of as the logical aspects of worldly thinking. Marx adopts Feuerbach's assessment. Hegel sets out from the estrangement of substance. From the absolute and fixed abstraction 13 fixed thought abstractions, torn from real mind and from real nature, become the shadowy objects of inquiry in Hegel's logic. 14.2. Marx traces the fixation of the abstractions investigated in Hegel's logic to his phenomenology of spirit, the true point of origin and the secret of the Hegelian philosophy. 15. Marx identifies Hegel's standpoint in the phenomenology as that of modern political economy. He grasps labor as the essence of man. However, much as the labor that constitutes value is abstract labor, the only labor which Hegel knows and recognizes is abstractly mental labor. 16. Marx spells out the connection between Hegel's reduction of activity to sheer activity and his positing an independent realm of logical abstractions. The rich, living, sensuous, concrete activity of self-objectification is therefore reduced to its mere abstraction. Absolute negativity, an abstraction which is again fixed as such and considered as an independent activity, as sheer activity. Because this so-called negativity is nothing but the abstract, empty form of that real living act, its content can in consequence be merely a formal content begotten by abstraction from all content. As a result there are general, abstract forms of abstraction pertaining to every content and on that account indifferent to, and, consequently, valid for, all content, thought forms or logical categories torn from real mind and from real nature. 17. To that accomplishment, Marx offers this backhanded compliment. Hegel's positive achievement here, in his speculative logic, is that the definite concepts, the universal fixed thought forms in their independence vis-a-vis nature and mind are a necessary result of the general estrangement of the human essence and therefore also of human thought. 18. Hegel's logic is the necessary outcome of his estrangement from the worldliness of human activity. His thoughts are therefore fixed mental shapes or ghosts dwelling outside nature and man. Hegel has locked up all these fixed mental forms together in his logic. 19. With Hegel, logic is the money of mind, logic, mind's coin of the realm, the speculative or thought value of man and nature, their essence grown totally indifferent to all real determinateness, and hence their unreal essence, is alienated thinking, and therefore thinking which abstracts from nature and from real man, abstract thinking. 20. In these observations on abstraction and logic in the economy of Hegel's thought, we find a remarkable anticipation of Marx's mature theory of value as congealed abstract labor and of money as the necessary expression of value, indifferent to the particularities of commodities. 21.3. Because Hegel reduces the rich, living, sensuous, concrete activity of self-objectification to sheer activity, to abstract thought, the only sort of objectivity that he recognizes is pure thinghood, a ghostly objectivity. It is equally clear that a self-consciousness can only establish thinghood, i.e. establish something which itself is only an abstract thing, a thing of abstraction and not a real thing. 22. Marx goes on to describe such an object as only the semblance of an object, a piece of mystification. 23. Likewise, Ricardo reduces wealth to congealed labor, the independent, material form of wealth disappears and wealth is shown to be simply the activity of men. 24.4. Marx objected to what he took to be Hegel's theological construal of logic. In describing Feuerbach's great achievement, Marx listed first he proved that philosophy is nothing else but religion rendered into thought. 25. Hegel treats the abstract entities of his logic as ideas in the mind of God, they function as archetypes for the creation of nature and spirit. 5. Hegel, then, mystified logic by treating it as purely a priori, just as indifferent to the real determinateness of nature and mind as value is indifferent to particular use values, as opposed to emerging by reflection on human reasoning about the world. 6. Following Feuerbach, Marx, in his early study of Hegel's philosophy of right, charged Hegel with imposing prefabricated logical forms onto his objects of study, such as the family, civil society, and the state. He develops his thinking not out of the object. Rather, he develops the object in accordance with ready-made thinking put together in the abstract sphere of logic. Point 26. Marx insists that concepts must arise out of one's thinking over the objects of inquiry in the world, or reflection on that thinking engagement. 7. Marx objects to the presuppositionlessness of Hegelian science. 8. Marx traces the mystification of the dialectic back to Hegel's logic, to his conception of the syllogism. Hegel's rational syllogism reverts to the still imperfect combination of immediacy and mediation characteristic of the sphere of essence. 27. In general, Hegel conceives of the syllogism as mediator, as a mixtum compositum. One can say that in his development of the rational syllogism the whole transcendence and mystical dualism of his system comes to the surface. The middle term is the wooden sword, the concealed opposition between universality and singularity. Point 28. Marx adds, anything further than this belongs in the critique of Hegelian logic. Point 29. If Marx were flatly opposed to logic, this task would be pointless. To what is rational in Hegel's method? Though one might think that Marx was flatly opposed to logic in anything like Hegel's sense, evidence exists against that conclusion, not least is Marx's desire to write up what is rational in Hegel's method. Marx recognizes the pertinence of logical categories and relations, not only those of ordinary formal logic. We do recognize common patterns in everyday and scientific reasoning whose content and movements can be attended to as such, though always as aspects of concrete reasoning about nature or spirit. In a passage from the first edition of Capital, Marx praises Hegel's attention to the content of some basic logical forms. Before Hegel, professional logicians even overlooked the content of the form of the paradigms of judgment and syllogism. Point 30. Attending to the content of forms belongs to the rational aspect of Hegel's method. In closing his chapter on wages, Marx writes, Hat is true of all forms of appearance, and their hidden background is also true of the form of appearance, value and price of labor, or wages, as contrasted with the essential relation manifested in it, namely the value and price of labor power. 31. Here Marx sees a point to making general observations regarding the categories of essence and appearance. The logical terminology of essence and appearance turns up in Marx's thinking about surplus value in relation to profit. Surplus value and the rate of surplus value are the invisible essence to be investigated, whereas the rate of profit and hence the form of surplus value as profit are visible surface phenomena. 32. To disclose profit as a necessary form of appearance, Marx first has to locate the source of all surplus value in surplus labor. Then Marx doubles back, reasoning from surplus value to profit, revealing profit to be the transformed form of surplus value. As he does in his account of money as the necessary form of appearance of value, Marx finds rational aspects to Hegel's insight into the logic of essence. The conventional interpretation of the logic of essence sees only the one-way dependence of appearance on essence. It does not recognize essence's dependence upon appearance. Essence must appear. Classical political economy recognizes the scientific demand to go past everyday phenomena and explain them in terms of essential relations. But, confined to its conventional understanding of the logic of essence and appearance, classical political economy does not see the point of doubling back and developing the categories of appearance from those of essence. 3. The shortcomings of political economy's conceptions about profit and the rate of profit. Classical political economy fails to develop a definitive conception of surplus value. It never gets to its absolute form. 33. Nonetheless, classical political economy makes progress. It topples the Trinity formula, which imagines the three factors of production, land, means of production, and living labor, to be the respective natural and independent sources of the three kinds of revenue: rent, interest/profit of enterprise, and wages. It reduces rent and interest/profit of enterprise to surplus labor. Contrasting classical political economy with vulgar economics, Marx offers this complex assessment: Classical political economy seeks to reduce the various fixed and mutually alien forms of wealth to their inner unity by means of analysis and to strip away the form in which they exist independently alongside one another. It seeks to grasp the inner connection in contrast to the multiplicity of outward forms. It therefore reduces rent to surplus profit, so that it ceases to be a specific, separate form and is divorced from its apparent source, the land. It likewise divests interest of its independent form and shows that it is a part of profit. In this way it reduces all types of revenue and all independent forms and title under cover of which the non-workers receive a portion of the value of commodities, to the single form of profit. Profit, however, is reduced to surplus value since the value of the whole commodity is reduced to labor. The amount of paid labor embodied in the commodity constitutes wages, consequently the surplus over and above it constitutes unpaid labor, surplus labor called forth by capital and appropriated gratis under various titles. 34 Here Marx allows that classical political economy has the three levels of concepts that he distinguishes in his own account, the particular appearance forms of surplus value, profit of enterprise, interest and rent, profit and surplus value. For all that it accomplished, however, classical political economy occasionally contradicts itself in this analysis. It often attempts directly, leaving out the intermediate links, to carry through the reduction and to prove that the various forms are derived from one and the same source. 35 This is not accidental, says Marx, this however is a necessary consequence of its analytical method, with which criticism and understanding must begin. Classical economy is not interested in elaborating how the various forms come into being genetisch zu entwickeln, but seeks to reduce them to their unity by means of analysis, because it starts from them as given premises. But analysis is the necessary prerequisite of genetical presentation, and of the understanding of the real, formative process in its different phases. 36 Classical political economy's failure to make sense of the development of categories shows its confinement to the bourgeois horizon. Ricardo was not the last word on profit and surplus value from the Ricardian school. Commenting on a little-known 1821 pamphlet entitled The Source and Remedy of the National Difficulties, a letter to Lord John Russell, Marx reflects on the limitations of Ricardo's theory of profit, identifies advances made by the author and brings out the limitations of the author's Ricardian standpoint. This scarcely known pamphlet contains an important advance on Ricardo. It bluntly describes surplus value as surplus labor, the labor which the worker performs gratis, the labor he performs over and above the quantity of labor by which the value of his labor power is replaced. Important as it was to reduce value to labor, it was equally important to present surplus value, which manifests itself in surplus product, as surplus labor. This was in fact already stated by Adam Smith and constitutes one of the main elements in Ricardo's argumentation. But nowhere did he clearly express it and record it in an absolute form. 37 This author's blunt description of surplus value as surplus labor counts as an advance over Ricardo. Marx identifies a second advance over Ricardo. He thus distinguishes the general form of surplus labor or surplus value from their particular forms, something which neither Ricardo nor Adam Smith does, at least not consciously or consistently. 38 The author self-consciously articulates the difference between surplus value and its several forms of appearance, whereas previous classical political economists were prone to mix up these different conceptual levels. Thus, this author makes some progress in addressing Marx's concern about a lack of proper mediation in thinking about surplus value, profit and surplus value's particular appearance forms, profit of enterprise, interest, and rent. All the same, the pamphlet has its limitations. The pamphlet is no theoretical treatise. It does not, consequently, make the claim that its conception of surplus value as surplus labor carries with it a general criticism of the entire system of economic categories, nor can this be expected of it. The author stands rather on Ricardian ground and is only consistent in stating one of the consequences inherent in the system itself. 39 A general criticism of the entire system of economic categories was the task that Marx undertook in Capital. 40 Let us turn from Marx's general assessment to a number of specific shortcomings of classical political economy directly pertaining to surplus value and profit. These points specify the difficulties in the entire doctrine of profit as previously conceived. 1. Where well thought out concepts of surplus value, profit and the specific forms of appearance of surplus value, profit of enterprise, interest, and rent, and their conceptual relationships are needed, the discourse of political economy is loaded with confusions, inconsistencies, and missing or mixed up distinctions. At bottom, surplus value, insofar as it is indeed the foundation of profit, but still distinct from profit commonly so called, has never been developed. 41 The general observation with which theories of surplus value begins is, all economists share the error of examining surplus value not as such, in its pure form, but in the particular forms of profit and rent. What theoretical errors must necessarily arise from this will be shown more fully in Chapter 3 of Capital Volume 3, in the analysis of the greatly changed form which surplus value assumes as profit. 42 2. Likewise, where well thought out concepts of the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value and their conceptual relationship are needed, we again get conceptual confusion. Ricardo's disciples, just as Ricardo himself, fail to make a distinction between surplus value and profit. It does not occur to them that, even if one considers not capitals in different spheres of production but each capital separately, insofar as it does not consist exclusively of variable capital, i.e., of capital laid out in wages only, rate of profit and rate of surplus value are different things, that therefore profit must be a more developed, specifically modified form of surplus value. 43.3 Political economy lacked the idea that the concept of profit must be developed out of the concept of surplus value and shown to be a transformed form of it. Hegelian ideas such as more developed forms lie beyond the bourgeois horizon of the classical political economists, for political economy did not correctly draw the conceptual distinction between labor power and labor, which provides the necessary foothold for developing the concept of surplus value. Engels spells out this failure: labor is the measure of value. Wages, the value of a definite quantity of living labor, are always smaller than the value of the product that is produced by this quantity of living labor, or in which this is expressed. The question of the value of labor is insoluble in this form. Marx posed it correctly, and thereby answered it. It is not the labor that has a value. It is not labor that is bought and sold as a commodity, but rather labor power. 44.5 Lacking the distinction between labor power and labor, political economy could not draw the distinction between constant and variable capital. Instead, it tangled it up with the distinction between fixed and circulating capital. 45.6 Lacking the distinction between constant and variable capital, political economy could not conceive properly of the rate of surplus value, the organic composition of capital, profit, or the rate of profit. 7. Political economy, then, lacked the correct account of the qualitative source of profit and the quantitative determinants of profit and of the rate of profit. So, political economy could not answer the question, what determines the average rate of profit? 8. Classical political economy failed to reconcile the classical labor theory of value with the fact that capitals of A, differing organic compositions of capital, and B, differing turnover times, tend to form a general rate of profit. Marx lays out the argument, concluding, the theory of value thus appears incompatible with the actual movement, incompatible with the actual phenomena of production, and it might seem that we must abandon all hope of understanding these phenomena. 46 Ricardo recognized the problem in the first chapter of his Principles. In fact, Marx shows that Ricardo's examples actually prove that his theory of value cannot be reconciled with the general rate of profit. 47 However, as Marx sets forth in detail, Ricardo obfuscated this result by throwing the spotlight on secondary matters. 48 Other political economists, notably Malthus, recognized this basic contradiction without finding a way to overcome it. Instead, they a. rejected the labor theory of value, Malthus, b. argued that it applied to pre-capitalist societies but not to capitalism, Torrens, or c. tried unsuccessfully to reconcile the contradiction through one subterfuge or another. Later Ricardians, point 49. On this contradiction, Engels observes, classical political economy was shipwrecked. Around 1839, the Ricardian school founded on surplus value. 50 At least by the writing of the Grundrisse in 1857-8, Marx knew that the labor theory of value in its individualistic conception is untenable. That was the truth at the other end of the stick Marx got hold of in overturning the received conceptions of surplus value and profit. To throw over the entire doctrine of profit as previously conceived, Marx had to overthrow the classical labor theory of value and redirect it from individual commodities and capitals to the heap of commodities and the total capital. For how Marx addresses these shortcomings of classical political economy. Marx draws the necessary distinctions, develops the required concepts and discovers how to reconcile a reconceived labor theory of value with the formation of a general rate of profit among firms of differing organic compositions and or turnover times. Marx draws the distinctions between labor and labor power and between constant and variable capital, clarifying how the latter distinction differs from that between fixed and circulating capital. These distinctions open the conceptual space for an adequate concept of surplus value and of the rate of surplus value, which, in turn, are needed in order to develop the concepts of profit and the rate of profit as transformed forms of surplus value and the rate of surplus value, respectively. To overthrow the existing doctrines of profit, Marx had to overthrow the individualistic classical labor theory of value. Only then could he reconcile a labor theory of value with the general rate of profit. Marx replaces the failed labor theory of value, which explains individual prices as expressions of individual values, with a holistic labor theory of value that holds at the aggregate level, that is, for the total capital, and explains subordinate phenomena on that basis. 51 Individual prices do not match individual values, individual profits do not match individual surplus values. Still, the labor theory of value holds at the aggregate level and explains individual phenomena with transformed value categories. The sum of the profits for all the different spheres of production must accordingly be equal to the sum of surplus values, and the sum of prices of production for the total social product must be equal to the sum of its values. 52 Prices of production explain individual prices no longer in terms of individual values but rather on the basis of cost price, the sum of constant and variable capital, plus profit, as determined by the average rate of profit, which depends on the aggregate surplus value, equals aggregate profit, the delta M of the total capital. 53 Individual profits are no longer explained by individual surplus values but by the transformed forms of surplus value and rate of surplus value, namely profit and rate of profit. Marx pulls together the crux of his objection to individualistic value theory, and the chief points of his holistic labor theory of value, in a passage from his criticism of Ricardo. What Marx calls cost price here is what he calls price of production in Volume 3. Hence, if profits as a percentage of capital are to be equal over a period, say of a year, so that capitals of equal size yield equal profits in the same period of time, then the prices of the commodities must be different from their values. The sum total of these cost prices of all the commodities taken together will be equal to their value. Similarly, the total profit will be equal to the total surplus value which all these capitals yield, for instance, during 1 year. If one did not take the definition of value as the basis, the average profit, and therefore also the cost prices, would be purely imaginary and untenable. The equalization of the surplus values in different spheres of production does not affect the absolute size of this total surplus value, but merely alters its distribution among the different spheres of production. The determination of this surplus value itself, however, only arises out of the determination of value by labor time. Without this, the average profit is the average of nothing, pure fancy. And it could then equally well be 1000% or 10%. 54 Marx will not abandon a labor theory of value. Without it, the general rate of profit, which is required to arrive at prices of production, is left unexplained. By the same token, we see why Marx objects to Ricardo's method, which treats value and the general rate of profit as being on the same conceptual level. The theory of value must account for the general rate of profit by accounting for the total surplus value, profit, before it can be used to explain the necessary transformation of values into prices of production. Implications of Marx's overthrowing of the classical doctrines of profit and value for the organization of capital. Since overthrowing previous doctrines of profit required Marx to overthrow the individualistic classical theory of value and replace it with a holistic one, there are major implications for how Marx had to organize capital. The classical labor theory of value fails not only as a theory of profit but also as a theory of prices. That conclusion might appear to consign the first volume of Capital to history's dustbin. Bohm-Bawerk claimed that Marx's theory of prices of production in Volume 3 contradicted his theory of value in Volume I, published in 1867. With what we know today, Bohm-Bawerk's claim looks quite different. But how shall we express this difference? Shall we say, simply, that Marx was well aware of a contradiction? After all, Marx recognizes the incompatibility of Ricardian value theory with a general rate of profit already in the Grundrisse. Or shall we take what I argue is the more plausible route of denying any contradiction between the first and third volumes of Capital? But how can we do that? Suppose that, 10 years after having overthrown Ricardo's individualist labor theory of value, Marx did not write hundreds of pages of Capital on the basis of it. Suppose that Capital is written, from the beginning, on the basis of the new, aggregate theory of value. Then Marx's claims about value and surplus value pertain to the heap of commodities and the total capital or their aliquot parts, not to individual commodities or capitals. 55 Applied to each actual individual commodity or capital, virtually all the claims of the first two volumes of Capital are false and long known to be false by Marx. If it can be avoided, why accept a reading of Capital volumes I and II that has such a consequence? We can avoid it by reading Capital as written from start to finish from the standpoint of the holistic labor theory of value that Marx developed in overthrowing previous doctrines of profit. When Marx uses examples and writes of particular commodities and capitals in the first two volumes, he refers not to actual individual commodities or capitals but rather to representative commodities and capitals that are aliquot parts of the total heap of commodities or capitals. 56 While it is generally false that individual commodities sell at prices determined by their individual values, it is true that an aliquot part of the heap of commodities would sell at a price determined by its value. Likewise, the profit realized by an individual capital will generally not be determined by the individual amount of surplus value created by the workers hired by that capital. But the profit to an aliquot part of the total capital would be determined by the surplus value created by the workers employed across all capitals. There is no contradiction between volumes I and III because Marx never puts forward the individualistic theory of value that he had demonstrated to be false by 1858. Discordant overlapping discourses, unmasking Capital's pretense to be self-valorizing. Marx organizes the three volumes of Capital in order to expose the capital fetish, Capital's pretense to match what Marx thought Hegel claimed for the concept. Marx organizes this disclosure across the three volumes of Capital by overlapping the apparent concept logic of capital and the essence logic of surplus value. He simultaneously develops the concept of capital, with its pretense to the self-contained development characteristic of Hegel's concept, self-valorization, and lays out the essence logic of surplus value, whereby surplus value necessarily appears as profit. Profit is the form of appearance of surplus value. 57 The concept of surplus value incorporates the antagonistic and exploitative class relationship between capitalists and wage workers. It lays bare capital's underpinnings. Marx calls attention to the disruption caused by the overlapping of the apparent concept logic of capital and the essence logic of surplus value. In surplus value, the relationship between capital and labor is laid bare. In the relationship between capital and profit, i.e. between capital and surplus value as it appears, Capital appears as a relationship to itself, a relationship in which it is distinguished as an original sum of value, from another new value that it posits. It appears to consciousness as if capital creates 55 C. Murray 2005. In capitalist production, each capital is assumed to be a unit, an aliquot part of the total capital, Marx 1963 1861-3, p. 416, Marx 1991, p. 299. Fred Mosely comments that this passage clarifies the important point that the individual capitals which Marx often used as illustrations in Volume I of Capital are not in fact individual capitals, but are instead ideal representatives of the total capital. And thus that the real subject of Volume I is this total capital, Mosely 2009, p. 142. This new value in the course of its movement through the production and circulation processes. Point 58 identifying this disruptive overlap specifies how Marx both accounts for and exposes capital's pretense to be a concept like self-valorizing automatic subject. That capital appears to valorize itself arises naturally out of the way that surplus value necessarily appears, that is, as profit. Profit is measured against the value of capital's inputs into the production process, cost price. Consequently, due to the formation of a general rate of profit, the magnitude of profit is a function of the magnitude of capital invested. Since it is proportional to its magnitude, and to nothing else apparent to everyday consciousness, capital's growth seems to be entirely its own doing. Marx's counter-discourse of surplus value exposes the truth about profit and capital's seemingly inherent power to valorize itself. The sole source of profit, hence of capital's valorization, is the unpaid labor of productive wage workers. The phenomenon of wages, like that of profit, supports capital's fetishistic pretense to independence, to be self-valorizing value. Marx reconceives wages as the transformed form of the value of labor power. Marx does not bring in the category of wages until chapter 19 of Volume I, after he introduces the concept of surplus value, and draws the distinctions between labor and labor power and between constant and variable capital and provides a thorough treatment of absolute and relative surplus value. The wage form includes features that are not present in the concept of the value of labor power. Marx introduces his examination of these features with this short paragraph: let us first see how the value, and the price, of labor power is represented in its converted Verwandelt form as wages. Point 59 The wage appears to be the price of labor, compensation for the labor done. On the surface of bourgeois society the worker's wage appears as the price of labor, as a certain quantity of money that is paid for a certain quantity of labor. Point 60 Hence all labor appears as paid labor. Point 61. Left unchallenged, this understanding of the wage as the price of labor would thwart Marx's laying bare of capital. Unpaid labor accounts for profit. The wage form blocks drawing the distinction between labor and labor power. It leaves no way to account for surplus value and allows no conceptual space for the essential category of variable capital. Like profit and the rate of profit, the wage is an appearance form that covers up the true source of profit. We may therefore understand the decisive importance of the transformation Verwandlung of the value and price of labor power into the form of wages, or into the value and price of labor itself. All the notions of justice held by both the worker and the capitalist, all the mystifications of the capitalist mode of production, all capitalism's illusions about freedom, all the apologetic tricks of vulgar economics, have as their basis the form of appearance discussed above, which makes the actual relation invisible, and indeed presents to the eye the precise opposite of that relation. Point 62 By first developing the essential categories of labor power and variable capital, and only later introducing the appearance form of wages, presented as the transformed form of the value of labor power, Marx discloses the wage form to be the necessary form of appearance of relations of domination and exploitation. This is a blow to the Trinity formula's assurance that all's well in the world of capitalist relations. This pattern runs throughout Capital. Marx moves from observable phenomena interpreted in everyday ways, for example, wages and profits, to their essential determinants. He then works back and develops the appearance forms as transformations of the essential forms. Of the revenue forms that Marx considers in the chapter on the Trinity formula, the wage is the first he develops. Notice how he describes each of these revenue forms. In each case, the term transformation Verwandlung signals that Marx is showing how an essential category, one of those that enable Marx to lay bare capital's pretenses, is, necessarily, transformed into a category of appearance that confirms capital's pretenses. Of course, in the Hegelian conception, which Marx adopts, these transformed categories of appearance belong to the essence. On reading chapters 4 and V of Capital Volume I, what Marx called the chapter on capital in the Grundriss, begins in capital with chapter 4, the general formula for capital. That formula is M, C, M plus delta M, and Marx calls delta M surplus value. As we learn in the first chapter of Volume 3, Cost, Price and Profit, this delta M is numerically, but not conceptually, the same as what Marx calls profit. Delta M is the profit to the total capital, M, which is identified in Chapter I of Volume 3 as total cost price. Cost price is the transformed form of the sum of constant capital and variable capital. If we call cost price K, the formula C equals C plus V plus S is transformed verwandelt sich into the formula C equals K plus S, or commodity value equals cost price plus surplus value. 63 in Chapter 4, then, Marx introduces the phenomenon that he intends to explain by developing the concept of surplus value and later showing that the category of profit is the transformed form of surplus value. It is the same phenomenon that Marx engages with at the beginning of Volume 3.64. The fact that Marx calls this delta M surplus value, not profit, and does not introduce the term profit until the first chapter of Volume 3, is important. It tells us much about how capital is organized and to what ends. Chapters 4 and V of Volume I are to be read in the light of the first two chapters of Volume 3, where Marx introduces the concepts of cost, price and profit and the rate of profit. The delta M that Chapter 4 introduces is not the delta M of this or that individual capital but rather the net profit to all capitals. Or, which amounts to the same thing, it is the delta M of an aliquot part of that total capital. Chapter V of Volume I makes it clear that the delta M of Chapter 4 refers to the sum of the profits to all capitals, or to an aliquot part of the total capital. 65 Though the delta M of this or that individual capital can be explained by the theory that surplus value arises out of circulation rather than production, by a markup theory, the fact that there is a net surplus value to the total capital cannot be explained in this way. In Chapter I of Volume 3, delta M appears as profit, a category that is conceptually paired with the category of cost price. This pairing distinguishes profit from the category of surplus value. Profit is defined as what remains after the cost price is deducted from the net proceeds from the sale of the commodities produced in the specified time period, as an excess of the sale price of the commodity over its cost price. 66 Marx argues that the category of cost price, by lumping constant and variable capital together, erases that essential distinction. 67 It naturally produces the illusion that delta M arises not in production but rather in circulation. Thus if commodity value is formed without any other element besides the capitalist's advance of value, there is no way of seeing how any more value is to come out of production than went into it, unless something is to come out of nothing. 68 If delta M cannot come out of production, as it cannot if the wage is the price of labor, then it appears that it must somehow come out of circulation. Colonel Torrens thus insisted that profit must arise in circulation, while Ramsay rebuked him for implying that value could come out of thin air. Marx cites both Torrens and Ramsay in Chapter V of Volume I and again in Chapter I of Volume 3.69. The way that Torrens accounts for delta M, for the total capital, which flows naturally from the appearance forms of cost, price and profit, is shown in Chapter V of Capital Volume I. To fail, gains and losses cancel one another out. This leaves the questions of what gives rise to delta M and what determines its magnitude unanswered. Not only are these questions unanswered, Marx charges that they are unanswerable on the basis of capital's uninvestigated appearance forms, cost, price, profit and rate of profit. He observes, but if we start from this rate of profit, we can never establish any specific relationship between the excess and the part of capital laid out on wages. 70. So, Marx does not start capital that way. Marx starts from the phenomena that appear as profit and the rate of profit. These appearances, as Marx argues in chapters I and II of volume 3, naturally lead to 1, concluding that delta M arises in circulation, not production, and 2, attributing to capital a mysterious power to throw off profits, to valorize itself. That pretense to self-valorization leads Marx in chapter 2 of volume 3 to compare capital to Hegel's concept. We might say in the Hegelian fashion that the excess is reflected back into itself from the rate of profit, or else that the excess, which is characterized more specifically by the rate of profit, appears as an excess which the capital produces over and above its own value. Capital appears as a relationship to itself, a relationship in which it is distinguished, as an original sum of value, from another new value that it posits. It appears to consciousness as if capital creates 65. In discussing in volume 3 the notion that surplus value derives from the sale of the commodity itself, Marx observes, we have already dealt with this illusion in detail in volume 1, chapter 5, Marx this new value in the course of its movement through the production and circulation processes. 71. Toward the end of chapter 4 of volume I, which takes up the same phenomena that will be examined in a very different light in the opening chapters of volume 3, namely as the necessary appearance of an essence, surplus value, as something other than itself, Marx describes capital as a concept-like automatic subject that changes its own magnitude, throws off surplus value from itself considered as original value, and thus valorizes itself independently. Value suddenly presents itself as a self-moving substance which passes through a process of its own. 72. In chapter 4 of volume I, Marx does not work through the reasons why profit seems to arise in circulation and capital seems to be an independent, self-moving substance, as he does in the opening chapters of volume 3. Marx does not introduce cost price, profit and rate of profit, as categories of appearance, until the beginning of volume 3, after he has developed the necessary essence categories, labor power as opposed to living labor, constant capital and variable capital, surplus value and the rate of surplus value, and has explored the dynamics of surplus value at length. When Marx does introduce the categories of profit and the rate of profit, he introduces them as transformations of the essential categories of surplus value and rate of surplus value, which appear necessarily as something other than themselves, namely profit and the rate of profit. We can compare what Marx does with surplus value and its form of appearance, profit, to what Marx does in chapter I of Capital volume I, with value and its form of appearance, money. Marx begins with a phenomenon that everyone is familiar with, namely, that a use value generally presents itself with a price. But he does not describe the phenomenon in that way. Instead, he says that wealth in the form of a commodity has an exchange value. 73. At the beginning of section 3, Marx again avoids using money or price, saying that commodities possess a double form, i.e. natural form and value form. So, when Marx introduces the money form as the culmination of the dialectic of the value form, he introduces it not as the familiar everyday phenomenon, commodities have prices, but rather as the necessary form of appearance of value, the transformed form of value, which has first been shown to be the essence of exchange value. 5. How did Hegel help Marx surpass Ricardo's theory of profit? Let us go to the crux of the matter before turning to some broader considerations. Marx writes of Adam Smith's thinking on surplus value and profit. Adam Smith should certainly have seen from this that he ought not to treat the general abstract form as directly identical with any of its particular forms. 74. As mentioned above, this failure to discriminate forms is one of the most fundamental criticisms Marx makes of previous theories of profit. Marx immediately attributes Smith's theoretical failure to a methodologically narrow empiricism. With all later bourgeois economists, as with Adam Smith, Lack of theoretical understanding needed to distinguish the different forms of the economic relations remains the rule in their course, grabbing at an interest in the empirically available material. Hence also their inability to form a correct conception of money, in which what is in question is only various changes in the form of exchange value, while the magnitude of value remains unchanged. Point 75. Here Marx associates the two chief failings of classical political economy. 1. It does not grasp the necessary formal difference between a commodity and the money for which it is exchanged, though their value magnitudes are the same, and 2. It does not grasp the necessary formal difference between profit and surplus value, though their value magnitudes are the same. Point 76. Here lies the short answer to the question, how did Hegel help Marx surpass Ricardo's theory of profit? Hegel taught Marx to take matters of form in earnest, not to take given concepts for granted but to probe their content in a painstaking empirical and conceptually self-reflective way that I call redoubled empiricism. Point 77. From Hegel, Marx learned to develop concepts, a thought foreign to the mindset of the classical political economists, to show how one concept is the transformed form of another, as profit is the transformed form of surplus value, and to demonstrate the necessity of such transformations. Point 78. More particularly, Marx learned from Hegel's logic of essence not to treat essence and appearance as separable. Essence must appear as something other than itself. Essence is not some imperceptible thing or force that stands alone, independent of its expression. No, the two are one complex reality. What Marx learned from Hegel, not an exhaustive list. 1. Immanent critique. Marx learned from Hegel to advance science by way of an immanent critique of previous thinkers. Point 79. Marx's mature theory of profit is a case in point. He arrives at it by probing the failure, which had been seen by Malthus, Bailey, and others, of the individualistic classical theory of value to account for the general rate of profit. 2. Conceptual clarity. Quite a few of the mistakes of the political economists involve lack of clarity about concepts. Often their concepts are vague, confused or ambiguous. Hegel wrote, philosophizing requires, above all, that each thought should be grasped in its full precision and that nothing should remain vague and indeterminate. Point 80. Marx's mature theory of profit is again a case in point, since, before Marx, no clear conceptual distinctions were drawn between labor and labor power, constant and variable capital, surplus value and profit, or the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit. 3. Not taking concepts for granted. Marx does not take categories for granted. Marx complains over and over about political economists taking concepts for granted rather than developing them, reaching back to his first serious encounter with them in the Paris manuscripts. One of Marx's basic criticisms of Ricardo is that he simply assumes the general rate of profit rather than probing it to determine its conceptual compatibility with his individualistic theory of value. Point 81. As we have seen, classical political economy made a bad showing where the category of wages was concerned. Classical political economy's unconsciousness of this result of its own analysis and its uncritical acceptance of the categories value of labor, natural price of labor, etc. as the ultimate and adequate expression for the value relation under consideration, led it into inextricable confusions and contradictions, as will be seen later, while it offered a secure base make it a principle to worship appearances only. Point 82. Because of his attention to forms, Marx's scientific agenda reaches far beyond the horizon of political economy. The idea that a system of categories needs to be criticized fits in perfectly with the aspirations of Marx's redoubled empiricism, but it is foreign to an empiricism unreflective about its categories. 4. Essence must appear as something other than itself. From Hegel's logic of essence, Marx learned the basic conceptual figure: essence necessarily appears as something other than itself. Essence and appearance are recognized to be inseparable. Hegel supersedes the conventional understanding of the categories of the essence logic as products of the reflecting understanding, which both assumes the distinctions as independent and at the same time posits their relationality as well. It does not bring these thoughts together. Point 83. Hegel's advance in grasping the logic of essence shows up in Marx's treatments of value and of surplus value. Value necessarily appears as something other than itself, money, Surplus value necessarily appears as something other than itself, profit. 5. Systematic dialectic. To develop concepts and transform forms, Marx learns from Hegel's logic to develop categories methodically, in a structure of mutual presupposition, not just to postulate them. Developing the necessary forms of appearance of essences is a crucial case of developing categories. Marx rebukes Ricardo for postulating a general rate of profit and then making a faulty effort to check to see if it is compatible with the law of value, as Ricardo had, too narrowly, as it turns out, conceived of it. 84 Needless to say, how from the mere determination of the value of the commodities their surplus value, the profit and even a general rate of profit are derived remains obscure with Ricardo. 85 More generally, Marx complains that Ricardo's principles, starting with the first chapter, is a conceptual hodgepodge. 86 Marx insists that the general rate of profit must be developed out of the theory of value, not simply postulated. The very idea of transformed forms is Hegelian in inspiration. When we move from the phenomena in their everyday interpretation to their essence, we move in order to comprehend them. In reversing directions and moving from essential categories to their necessary forms of appearance, we grasp appearance forms, such as money and profit, as transformed forms of essential categories, value and surplus value, respectively. In proceeding in this way, Marx develops categories and achieves a conceptually adequate representation of capitalist actuality, absolute form. Chapter 9 The circular course of our representation, Schein, Grund, and Erscheinung in Marx's economic works. Igor Hansel. Introduction. The aim of this chapter is to deal with the methodological aspects of Marx's economic works, and here especially with the ways he proceeds from a certain cluster of concepts of political economy as a science to other ones. 1. I start with a short overview of Marx's procedures in Capital Volume I leading to the manuscript. Chapter 6. Results of the immediate process of production and show how they correspond to a circular type of theory construction. For a better understanding of this type of theory construction, I then analyze Hegel's logico-categorial reconstruction of the movement of scientific knowledge from Schein via Wesen to Erscheinung as given in his Science of Logic, and I show how Marx draws on Hegel's category clusters Schein, Wesen, and Erscheinung, and their orderings. Based on this account, I also propose a translation into English of the category pair Schein and Erscheinung that takes into account these peculiarities. Because I make this proposal only at the end of this chapter, I shall use throughout my text the German terms for this pair as well for categories that are related to it. As the primary source for the quotations, I will use the texts published in the Mega Edition. All the quotes in English are my translations from German. For a better understanding of the categories employed by Marx, I insert into the English quotations in square brackets the corresponding German terms in their basic, for example, infinitive form. In the English translations of quotations from Hegel's Wissenschaftler Logik, I use the German terms for those categories. In order to distinguish the categories of cognition from their linguistic expressions, I put the former in italics and the latter in quotation marks. I capitalize those categories which stand for clusters of categories. Finally, I give an epistemological account of the category pair Schein and Erscheinung with respect to Marx's economic works, together with a description of the peculiarities of German syntax in relation to that pair. Based on this account, I propose an interpretation of the term subject from Chapter 4 of Capital Volume I, and of chosen sections in Marx's manuscripts used by Engels in the publication of Capital Volume 3.21. Marx's circular logic of theory construction. Marx starts Chapter I of Capital Volume I, with the following statement. 1. This paper was written with the support of the Grant Vega, No. 1/0221/14. 2. See Marx 1992 and Marx 2012. I would like to thank Dr. Gerald Hubman from the Berlin Brandenburgische Akademie der Wissenschaften in Berlin, Germany, for enabling me to access the manuscript Marx 2012 shortly before its publication. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears erschienen as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Our investigation therefore begins with the analysis of the commodity. 3. Then, In a sequence of steps he subjects the commodity to a series of analyses, based on which he reduces in thought the exchange value of a commodity to its value character, and then in turn derives the concepts of exchange value and money as a form of exchange value. This enables him also to move to understanding how surplus value is produced. All these steps, finally, lead, or to be more precise, if Marx had stuck to his initial plan, should have led, to Chapter 6. Results of the immediate process of production. Its most important aspect, from the point of view of this chapter, is what Marx labels as Cirkel auf unsere Darstellung, that is, the circular course of our representation for with respect to what should have been the end of the first volume of Capital. The commodity, as the elementary form of bourgeois wealth, was our point of departure, the prerequisite for the emergence of capital. On the other hand, commodities appear